Hi, we are Group 3 for the derivatives course in fall 2023. And today we will be walking through a case surrounding the leverage interest rate swap scandal that happened on PNG back in 1994. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Here's an outline of today's presentation. We will start by giving a brief introduction on PNG and then talk about what happened. Then we will walk through a simple break-even analysis to have a better understanding on the swap and how we can potentially hedge against the risk. And lastly, we will discuss a little bit about our view on Treasury Department's operations and conclude today's case on how the scandal evolved and settled and our key takeaways. Next, please. So, founded back in 1837 by William Proctor and James Gamble in Cincinnati, Ohio, PNG paved their way to become the multinational consumer goods corporation, providing goods that exist in almost every household, from soap to detergent to oral care and beauty products, as you can glimpse through the brand here on the right-hand side. So having more than 150 years of operating history, they unfortunately made headline on 1994 when they announced a one-time pre-tax charge of 152 million against net income. This charge, however, was not from its operating activities. Rather, it was from interest rate hedge that went south. I will hand it off to Yuchen for more detail on what happened.
Yeah, so now let's dive deeper into the nature of the scandal. So the purpose of Procter & Gamble using derivative securities was to manage its interest rate exposure and financing costs more effectively. So at that point of time, they were holding the debt that has a fixed interest rate, and they want to take advantage of the decreasing floating interest rate. So they enter into the interest rate swap agreement with Bankers Trust. An agreed interest rate swap had a term of 5 years and a notional amount of $200 million rather than $100 million initially planned. For the first 6 months, it called for Procter & Gamble to receive a fixed interest rate of 5.3% and pay to Bankers Trust a 30-day average commercial paper floating interest rate minus 75 basis points. And for the remaining 4.5 years, the rate would be set on May 2nd, 1994. Into a complex formula which added a spread to the base interest rate set at 30-day average commercial paper rate minus 75 basis points. And the spread was linked to the difference between the yield on 5-year Treasury bond and the price of 30-year Treasury bond. So when you're looking at the formula, initially you might get a wrong impression of the formula is set on the difference of either price or either yield or price of 5-year Treasury bond or 30-year Treasury bond. So if they were actually set on the differential in yields or price of 5 and 30-year treasuries, the risk is actually reduced because the positions are taken in highly liquid standardized instruments, and both positions is closely related assets, reducing the exposure to the market risk and credit risk. And the relationship between the price of 5 and 30-year treasuries tends to be more stable and predictable over time due to the similar risk profiles and the market participants involved in this segment of the treasury market. But in contrast, Bankers Trust chose to use a more complex and mismatched differential, which potentially confused the clients like Procter & Gamble. So they're actually using the difference between the yield on a 5-year Treasury bond and the price of 30-year Treasury bond. So the complicated formula vowed the explosive nature of the spread, making it more ambiguous and difficult to gauge, leading to substantial and unexpected financial consequences. So I've categorized the nature of the scandal into 3 categories. So first, it's complex and it has a risky structure. So the interest rate swap were not plain vanilla. Instead, they involve the complex structure linked to the difference between the yield of a 5-year Treasury bond and the price of 30-year Treasury bond. And the second is a mismatched and contrived differential. So the selective differential exacerbated the impact of the interest rate changes, while a small interest rate hike would result in a minor increase in the 5-year yield. So it would cause a significantly decline in the 30-year bond price, thereby amplifying their differential on which the spread was based. So longer duration bonds like 30-year Treasury are more sensitive to the interest rate changes, which significantly increase the risks. And also, additionally, the chosen formula also embedded high leverage. So the derivative structure included high level of leverage magnifying the impact of the interest rate movements on PNG payments. So this leverage amplified the risk and potential losses, which were possibly not fully understood by PNG. Now I'll hand it over to JS to talk about more about the characteristics of PNG treasury operations.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, PNG treasury operations can be described as a cost center rather than a profit center, given the mandates of the department, which were funding at lowest cost of capital and hedging risks. To reiterate, the first mandate focused on minimizing the cost, while the second mandate was focused on minimizing risks. So if PNG was to choose profit center as a model for its treasury, it should consider things described on the slide, including clear ROI objectives and aligned KPIs. So it's important to note that leverage interest rate swaps involves significant financial risks, and careful risk management is essential to mitigate potential losses. The charter should strike a balance between profit objectives and risk management to ensure that the Treasury Department operates prudently and within the firm's risk tolerance. And regular monitoring and adherence to the charter's guidelines are critical to achieving profit goals while safeguarding the firm's financial health as well. So the next slide will be the break-even exposure.
Right, so the break-even point that gives the swipe spread of 0 basis point would require the 5-year CMT yield to be approximately 5.57%. For the break-even monetary equivalent of 0 in column 6, the 5-year CMT yield needs to be approximately 5.61%. That would be an increase of 66 basis points from 4.95. And this would lead to a net spread of 75 and to a break even in the monetary equivalent. However, the outcome is highly unlikely considering the reverse pricing dynamic between the 5 years CMT yield and 30-year treasury bond price. In terms of hedging exposure, there is substantial difficulties in hedging the exposure in this case. If Procter & Gamble hedged the swipe with 5-year treasury bond future, the rise in 5-year CMT yield cannot cover the financial loss due to the presence of the leverage. In contrast, the loss in hedging from a decline in 5-year CMT yield cannot be covered by the 1.5 million cash flow. However, PNG can still use a plain vanilla interest swipe and a put option to replace the leverage swipe to reduce the exposure. Procter & Gamble can write put option on 15-year treasury, and this will generate income while limiting losses in comparison with leverage swipe.
All right, so the eventual outcome of the scandal led to a total loss of 152 million. PNG then sued Banker Trust on racketeering, fraud, misrepresentation. Basically means that Banker's Trust is deceiving and didn't do their job. However, the judge dismissed most of the charges and stated that the swap was not security and that Banker's Trust had no fiduciary responsibility. The lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, where the swap wasn't rescinded, nor does Banker's Trust have to pay for punitive damages. PNG was eventually excused from 83% of the owed payment, and unsurprisingly, Banker's Trust's reputation was irreparably damaged. Next, please. So despite the fact that Bankers Trust had a long time being PNG's financial service provider, the judge ruled that they do not have a fiduciary responsibility. So let's understand what that means. Fiduciary means trust, and fiduciary duty is a legal concept where one party, in this case PNG, engages in a relationship of confidence, good faith, and trust with another party, which is Bankers Trust, from which aid, advice, and protection is expected. For example, lawyers have a fiduciary duty to act in the best interest of their clients. No profit should be made unless explicit consent was granted when the relationship begins. However, if you think about the relationship between PNG and Bankers Trust is more of a business partner, and the restriction towards them is more on the suitability rather than fiduciary. We think that based on the relationship, Bankers Trust have no fiduciary responsibility, but they have the obligation to make sure their recommendation is suitable, and that disclosure would be required if the other party does not have the knowledge. That's why the swaps are not rescinded, nor was Bankers Trust fined for his act. I will hand it off to JS to discuss the lesson learned.
So there are some lessons learned throughout this event. Some of the most important lessons are as follows. First, failure to set a clear mission for Treasury as a profit center. The main objectives of PNG's Treasury Department were procuring financing at the lowest possible cost of capital and hedging risk by limiting the firm's exposure to exchange rate and interest rate risk. But given that each has a goal of minimizing the cost of capital and minimizing risks, the department was not focused on profit making. Second, failure to consider worst case scenarios. So basically, P&G bet on interest rate decrease, which means they could have expected the opposite case. They should have applied stress testing and multiple scenario analysis in order to get to the amount of potential loss in the case of the opposite scenario. And lastly, failure to report leverage. P&G chose an OTC tailor-made derivative transaction over exchange-traded products, which have the merit of forcing the posting of a margin collateral, a mark-to-market on a daily basis, and therefore imposing a reality check on their users. Therefore, if P&G had developed an in-house reporting system which mimics the margining system used for exchange-traded products, the result would have been better.
Okay, and I think this is the end of our presentation, and thank you.